The story starts with a kid playing a strategy RPG on his PC, even while in the hospital. Out of nowhere, his body gets heavy, everything goes black, and his mind is sucked into an imaginary ocean. Until, suddenly, he wakes up in a forest, sitting all cool on a stone throne. And to complete the isekai combo, a woman approaches, speaking to him as if she'd been waiting for the handsome guy to wake up. When she steps out of the shadows, it hits the kid right away. It was none other than Atu Amacinta, an elf who called him king. The game he was playing in the hospital was a dark fantasy strategy simulator called Eternal Nations, and the character he loved most, the one standing right in front of him now, was this very elf. Now, he couldn't help but wonder, should he act like the king she claimed he was? It was clear she saw him as the leader of Minogra. Sensing his confusion, the girl smiles and says, "It's all right, Takuto." After all, he beat Nightmare difficulty using what was considered the hardest civilization in the game, the ruined civilization, Minogra. Because of that, Era Takuto became the legendary player at the very top of the global leaderboard. Atu, for her part, remembered every moment they played together, how they had conquered the world side by side time and again, so there was no need for him to worry, she knew exactly who he was. Thinking back, Takuto realized Atu matched his own playstyle, maybe because he'd always wanted to be as strong as she was. Tears welled up in his eyes as he admitted how happy he was to finally speak to his favorite character. She said she felt the same. Takuto asked if this was heaven, and if Atu was the one who'd brought him here, but she explained that she, too, had simply appeared in this place out of the blue, and it didn't seem much like paradise. If anything, she thought, it felt more like the world of Eternal Nations, no doubt about it. She said it was a miracle, and it was a true honor to meet her master in person. With that, the elf knelt before the boy, took his hand, and invited him to start again, just the two of them, building a kingdom of their own. As tempting as the offer was, Takuto was still lost in confusion. Even so, with his loyal companion by his side, maybe this was his chance to relive those golden days in this new world. So, Takuto called on his servant to begin their journey together. Au Amacinta introduced herself as the child born from the mud who will bring destruction to the world, declaring that, from now on, her body and mind belonged solely to her master. Hearing this over-the-top speech, Takuto cringed so hard he almost had a stroke. He realized that saying this stuff in real life is way harder than in the game, and Atu admitted it was a little embarrassing for her, too. Still, the king decided to play along, calling the elf his first and only subordinate, his confidant and right hand. Then Takuto asked if his servant knew what Minogra's first move should be, and in perfect sync, the two replied, "Let's go into hiding." Next, Takuto summons a scout using emergency production. Without delay, a creature known as a long-legged insect crawls out of a portal, a sight both Takuto and Atu found a bit gross, to be honest. Still, Takuto reminded himself that Minogra was a civilization of moderation that wielded evil and ruin, so they'd need to keep that in mind. For Atu, that meant they had to do everything possible to avoid revealing their true identities. First order from the king, he sent the insect to scout the area without being seen. Watching the bug scuttle off, Takuto realized he could see through its eyes. That summoning had cost him 100 mana, leaving him with 100 more. To set up the base, the operations sector, would cost another 20. Atu lays down the law that emergency production costs a ton of mana, so they should be careful with their spending. Takuto admitted he really wanted to create a warrior to defend them, but that would probably drain all his mana. Speaking of combat, the elf pledged to do her best, or at least, that's what she wanted to say, if she weren't so weak right now. Takuto understood. Atu was a hero unit who got stronger over time, but at the moment her strength was only 3, less than even some basic enemies. In short, their entire plan to build Minogra was at serious risk if they were attacked by pretty much anything. Using the scout's vision, Takuto surveyed the land around them, forest as far as the eye could see. So far, no monsters in sight. Au thought the forest was a perfect place to hide, but found it strange that the long-legged insect hadn't spotted a single animal along the way. Even worse, Takuto realized there was absolutely nothing to eat. All they could do was stay alert and hope something turned up. Atu apologized for not being more helpful, but the boy told her that just having her company was more than enough, making her eyes shine with joy. Seeing her so moved, he thought to himself how hard it had been to notice these little things in the game, but Atu's personality really was just like this. Putting that aside, through the scout's eyes, Takuto soon discovered a community of dark elves not far away. He explained that this type of elf tended to be neutral, maybe leaning a bit toward evil, which, honestly, was a relief. At the very least, it confirmed that they really were in the world of eternal nations. On the downside, if there was another civilization's settlement nearby, it could spell trouble. Avoiding war at the start of the game was crucial. So, their top priority was to find a safe place to settle, but before that, they needed to keep an eye on the Dark Elves and gather more information. If things went south, they'd just have to make a run for it. Suddenly, speak of the devil, a small group of Dark Elves appeared before the stone throne where Minogra's two companions sat. To them, our man Takuto was just a shadowy, sinister figure, a vision so terrifying it made their leader, Jia, break out in a cold sweat. Convinced he was witnessing the devil himself, incarnate, knowing his actions could decide the fate of his entire race, Jia composed himself and stepped forward. Bowing, he introduced his companions as members of the Mazeram clan. His own name was Jia Najeev, and he apologized for entering the forest without permission from what appeared to be the master of these lands. With a chilling expression, Atu recognized that this elf truly understood the gravity of trespassing here, but wanted to know the reason. Jia explained that their clan lived in Iragia, but they were persecuted and forced to flee into the forest. He tried to tell their whole story, but Atu pressed him to keep it brief, making Jia more and more anxious not to make a mistake that would put his people at risk. Amidst this, Takuto commented on how thin the Dark Elves looked, and Jia admitted, with a heavy heart, that they hadn't found any food there. The elf then wondered why his clan had to endure so much suffering, when all they wanted was a peaceful place to live. Out of nowhere, the supposed master of the shadowy forest offered him a handful of apples. Takuto mentioned that they taste delicious if you cut them into the shape of a rabbit. Jia had never seen fruit like this and wondered if it would be rude to try one on the spot. But the rest of his group was too hungry for such concerns. They bit into the apples and smiles spread across their faces. But that wasn't all. Takuto opened a portal and handed out pears as well. Jia bowed even lower, saying there were others like them, including small, starving children. So, instead of eating now, he asked for permission to take the fruit back to the others. Takuto listened, felt sorry for them, and handed over even more food, this time with bread and vegetables too. Witnessing what seemed like a miracle, Jia Najeev reflected on how the Dark Elves had always been despised. Marked by scorn, Jia's people were forced to live in the shadows, and no one had ever reached out to help them. Overwhelmed by such power and mercy, Najeev finally dared to ask, who was this individual sitting on the throne? Meanwhile, back at the Dark Elf settlement, those who hadn't traveled were doing their best to bear the hunger. Then, suddenly, the foraging party returned, their leader grinning from ear to ear with the best news possible. The famine was finally over. With all that food, joy swept through the whole village. Later, while the community slept, Najeev sat by a campfire. The old elder Molter came over to compliment the chief on his work. Molter said he'd lived a long life, but never had he seen such strange and delicious fruit. Najeev agreed. And that was exactly why the old man wanted to know what had led the clan to such circumstances. Ready to share the truth, Jia said he'd met a legendary being deep in the forest. According to legend, a being was sealed away in the cursed lands. Molter was stunned, wondering if the expedition had encountered the ruined king, a figure found in old books and stories. When the world reached its limit, the ruined king would appear, bringing devastation to all. As much as no one could say for sure, it was also impossible to say the legend was just a lie. Jia, for his part, never caught the being's name, but had to admit that the frightening appearance fit the title of Ruined King all too well. The entity was simply beyond comprehension, but at least he had a servant who could clarify his words. Whatever the case, even without certainty, Molter senses that this is nothing good. Now that his stomach and a bit of his mana are replenished, The elder can feel it clearly. This forest is far from normal. He wonders if Jia gave the entity something in exchange for the food. But the chief insists that's not the case. Molter doesn't buy it. He argues that the King of Ruin would never do a good deed without expecting something in return. But Jia swears there was no price. It genuinely seemed to be an act of mercy. His Grace, as Jia calls him, saw the dire situation the Dark Elves were in and showed them compassion. Hearing this, Elder Molter is infuriated that Jia would refer to the King of Ruin as His Grace, and starts to suspect that the leader has fallen under the entity's spell. That's when an argument breaks out between these two pillars of the community. Jia insists they owe the utmost respect to someone who fed their people. In fact, he turns the question back on the elder, asking what he would have done. But even Molter can't answer, so he apologizes. From now on, he declares, as the head of the Maze Ram Dark Elves, he'll personally handle matters with the King of Ruin. After all, Molter has lived for 2 centuries, he's sure he can figure something out. Meanwhile, back with Minogra's founders, Atu scolds her master for blowing through a bunch of mana to feed the Dark Elves, reminding him that they need to start building their own nation. Takuto, a little sheepish, admits that he needs his companion now more than ever. Hearing this, Atu drops her tough act and slips into a weirdly love-struck, submissive mode, as if a single kind word from her master is enough to make her melt completely. Takuto, meanwhile, laments that he just couldn't manage to communicate properly with the Dark Elves. No matter how hard he tried, the words just wouldn't come out. Atu confesses she thought he was just trying to act like a mysterious mastermind who hates long speeches and lets his subordinates handle the details. But the truth is, my friends, the kid is just terrible at communication. He never was in his previous life, and it's not like he was suddenly going to become a master of rhetoric and charisma overnight. In other words, he wasn't quiet to look cool, he was quiet because he's shy as hell. The next day, the Elder Molter asks the young elf leader if he's ready to return to the place where the King of Ruin awaits them. As soon as the elf agrees, the experienced elder gets a bad feeling about it, worried about what that entity might want in return for helping his people. Even though Jia insists he never mentioned any kind of payment, the old elf knows the score. After all, evil beings always expect some kind of reward. Regardless, he understands the Dark Elves need the king's help to survive. Jia agrees, pointing out that even if they left the forest to search for food, they could still come back empty-handed. Speaking of leaving the forest, Molter reminds them that one of their hopes is for the clan to reach the Dark Continent and find a kingdom where they won't be hunted, and that maybe this is their last chance. With that said, both leaders agree on one thing: the fate of their people is in their hands. But what they don't know is that our boy Takuto is spying on this whole conversation thanks to his scout. The scene then changes, where the scout quickly returns to his master to report that the Dark Elves would be arriving soon. Atu, our protag servant, already suspected the elves wouldn't be able to carry all the food in a single trip. Takuto, for his part, points out that having people with different cultures and technologies nearby could easily lead to conflict. In fact, he'd prefer if they just took the rest of the food and got the hell out as fast as possible. But the truth is, he's worried he won't be able to negotiate with the elves because of his communication problem, which could cause misunderstandings down the line. Seeing this, Atu offers to handle the negotiations on her master's behalf, which would also serve to elevate the king's grandeur. He accepts and thanks her. The scene changes once more, and now we see that as night falls, Jia arrives before the King of Ruin, accompanied by the tribe's elder, who introduces himself as Molter Cordal Mazrim. First things first, Molter expresses his gratitude for the king's generosity, and then asks for the honor of learning his great name. Cautiously, Atu looks at the king, who gives a nod of approval. Taking the hint, she introduces him as Ira Takuto, Lord of the Apocalypse and Ruler of Ruin, and demands he be treated as formally as possible, leaving Jia visibly impressed. Atu also introduces herself, and Molter vows to engrave both their names into the very soul of his people. Watching silently, Takuto thinks everything is going smoothly so far. After that, Atu tells the elves they can take the food and leave. Molter then asks how he could repay the King of Ruin for his help, but the elf woman immediately waves it off, insisting they could never offer anything worthy of the king's greatness. Besides, since the Mazrim clan has nothing valuable enough to match such generosity, Atu interprets this as a suspicious attitude, which makes the exchange tense. She questions if the elves are planning something behind all this empty talk. Sensing the tension in the air, Takuta whispers a few things into his servant's ear. She flips out, grumbling that these elves are terrible negotiators and that if they don't leave the king alone, they'll only cause trouble and should be annihilated for it. Raising her voice, Atu declares that their heads would look perfect mounted on pikes. Takuto, meanwhile, tells everyone to calm down, guessing that the Mazrim just want to build a relationship that benefits everyone. So, maybe it's best to accept some form of compensation just to put their minds at ease. With that, Atu turns to the Dark Elves and announces that the king is willing to accept a token of gratitude for his charity. As relief washes over the Mazrim's faces, Takuto realizes the elder must have suspected a catch, considering the King of Ruin's evil alignment. Picking up on these unspoken cues, Atu calls the old man a fool for thinking Ira Takuto is some wicked ghost or malevolent spirit. Setting that aside, since she has no idea what to actually ask for in return, she thinks for a moment and decides it would be good to hear everything the Dark Elves know about the world beyond the forest. Molter offers to share all his knowledge, and Atu demands that the Mazrim clan leave the forest once their pact is fulfilled. Gia is clearly shaken by this demand, and Takuto immediately sees he's much easier to read than the elder. Molter admits that nothing would make his clan happier than being allowed to stay in the forest, but Atu won't allow it. Furthermore, if the Mazrim want to keep the lives that were spared, they must not speak of what happened here. Faced with the weight of this ultimatum, Gia seems ready to protest, but Molter calms him and resumes the negotiations, expressing gratitude for the audience with the king and agreeing to everything Atu laid out. As the Dark Elves depart, Takuto wonders if this is really the right thing to do. After all, if the Mazrim are exiled, they'll likely collapse somewhere along the way. Knowing that exile could very well mean death, the King of Ruin extends his hand and invites the elves to become his subjects. Outraged, Atu asks what the hell the king is thinking. He explains he was considering using the refugee system. After all, Dark Elves aren't inherently good or evil, but if they're accepted as refugees into the civilization Takuto plans to build, and if things work like they did in the game, the elves would eventually become evil like them. Atu agrees it's possible for beings of different evil alignments to coexist, but points out that Dark Elves are nothing like Minogra's main citizens, the homunculi, which could create friction. Takuto admits it's risky, but asks Atu to jog her memory and remember what the homunculi look like, and if she could handle living with only those creatures as citizens. She admits it's impossible to put up with their ugliness and stupidity for all eternity and that it would mess with their minds. Atu turns to the Mazrim and announces her master's intention to soon found a nation. If the elves are willing to become citizens, they'll be protected by the king and promised eternal happiness. Last but not least, Atu tells them the real deal. The Dark Elves will become evil beings. With that, they're free to choose their own fate. But, adding a personal note, Atu assures them their side is a lot more fun than it looks. In the next scene, while walking toward the Dark Elves tribe, Atu kept reminding Takuto to watch his step, since he was barefoot. She pointed out that, although it took some time, the Mazrim had finally agreed to become citizens of Minogra. Even though they hesitated at the idea of becoming evil, deep down, they knew from the start this was their best option. Eventually, the pair arrived at the tribe and were greeted by the people, all kneeling in respect. Some looked genuinely excited at the sight of that mysterious entity, while one elf even fainted after feeling the dark miasma swirling around him up close. Soon after, Takuto was led to a throne, and Atu formally welcomed all the Dark Elves as citizens of Minogra, which was now officially founded. From that moment on, the safety of every member of the Mazrim clan would be protected by the great King of Ruin. Still confused, Gia wondered if that was all that would happen. He'd been told that he and his companions would become evil, but he didn't feel any different. Suddenly, a deep-seated hatred welled up inside him, a rage against those who had hunted, mocked, and exiled his people from their own land. Another elf felt the same, which made her declare that she hated every living being in existence. The same feeling could be seen on the faces of every elf in the tribe. Amid all this, Takuto approached Gia to ask if he was alright, and the Mazrim leader realized that this, too, was a form of happiness, the joy of being cared for. Then, with tears in their eyes, all the elves greeted King Ira Takuto, their enthusiasm so overwhelming that even the king himself had no idea why everyone was so worked up. Meanwhile, Atu simply smiled with pride and satisfaction. A few days after founding the nation, Takuto looked at the map of the continent that Molter had given him and muttered that he was cornered. Atu asked what was going on and, flailing on the floor like a kid throwing a tantrum, the leader complained that their kingdom had the worst possible starting position, as there were already two major nations on the continent. To the east was the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a human civilization devoted to the holy god Arlos, and to the west, Elna, a kingdom of elves who worship nature. In other words, if either of those nations discovered their evil nation to the south, there wouldn't be anything left but dust, especially since Minogra was just starting out and still incredibly weak. To make matters even worse for our protagonist and his people, these lands were so cursed they didn't have a single natural resource they could harvest. However, it wasn't all a tragedy. They remembered that Minogra had the homunculi as its base population, who, as fertile and happy as they might be, were still dumb and consequently made it impossible to produce any research. But now, for the first time, the nation didn't have to rely solely on them, since the Dark Elves were part of the kingdom and could cover those weaknesses. Speaking of which, Atu's ears twitched. She announced that the elves were back, ready to report on the outside world. Without delay, the tribe's elder met with the King of Ruin, alongside the other elf leader. This time, Gia brought his assistant, Emil, since she was smart and well-versed in legends and the ways of other nations. Turning to plans for the future, Atu revealed that the Mazrim would be assigned to key positions in Minogra's administration. Molter would oversee state affairs, since he could use magic and it was a position of great responsibility. Gia would lead Minogra's warriors, also taking charge of recruiting new forces. Gia enthusiastically accepted the new role and promised that if the king commanded, he would show no mercy to any enemy and would display their impaled corpses as a warning. Hearing this, Takuto nearly crapped his pants, leaving Gia genuinely confused. To smooth things over, Atu explained that Takuto preferred peace, which left Gia kind of bugging out. After all, why the hell would the King of Ruin be a pacifist? Anyway, with everyone's role set, Atu told the elves to get some good rest, and when they were in good health, to start building houses. Seeing that Gia had put his foot in his mouth, Molter expressed his deepest gratitude to the king and insisted that, unlike Gia, who only took pride in his muscles, the elder would prove his worth with wisdom. Gia fired back, promising to show off his own vitality, something an old man like Molter could never match. Unsure what to say, Emil just mentioned that she'd work hard, leading Atu to whisper to Takuto that these people seemed a little obsessed with work. Finally, she asked if she should order the gathering of resources, but Takuto suggested developing the area without destroying the forest. Hearing that, Atu turned to Elder Molter to ask if they could collect wood while keeping parts of the forest intact. The elf assured her they could. Their people had always lived in harmony with nature. Hearing this, Gia was baffled not just by how peaceful these elves could be, but also by the fact that the King of Ruin wanted to protect the flora and fauna, despite being considered evil. But that wasn't all. Takuto declared that his citizens should always be reforesting, though it was clear that the Dark Elves had no idea what that meant. Thinking back to the game's tech tree, Takuto guessed, based on what he'd heard so far, that the people in this world were probably at a technological level somewhere around fortress construction. Atu asked if the Dark Elves were familiar with terms like military magic and the 6 main elements. Molter replied that he knew of the 4 main elements, a basic concept in magic. Emil added that she'd never heard any other nation mention military magic. So Atu realized that this world hadn't reached the level of 6-element magic technology yet and was behind in other areas, too. Setting that aside, the elf explained that reforestation was the practice of planting trees where they'd been harvested in order to maintain the environment. Emil admitted this strategy wasn't part of their tradition, while the elder noted that, in reality, it takes centuries for trees to mature after they've been cut down. Atu goes on to say that reforestation is a kind of technology that requires all the main elements and that this knowledge, in fact, comes from their mighty king Ira Takuto. She makes a point of letting everyone know that their king is 100 times more amazing than anyone could imagine, and Takuto can't help but feel a bit embarrassed by all the praise. Still, Atu insists that their ruler's wisdom covers countless fields and that the people of Minogra are blessed to receive his favor. Emil asks if the apples they were given are also the king's invention, and Atu, without batting an eye, confirms they are, and then casually adds that the grapes are his creation too. Speaking of which, Emil says she planted the seeds of that purple fruit and can't wait to watch them grow. At that moment, Takuto realizes he could use emergency production to create things that don't even exist in the game, like gunpowder, metals, and oil. And as soon as the king realizes this, the nation of Minogra is granted the divine privilege, the ruler's ability to produce anything he knows about, with the mana cost varying based on the item's complexity. And with this new divine ability that could be so game-breakingly OP it's not even funny, today's episode comes to an end. What's our king gonna do with this much power? Wanna find out? You know the drill. Let me know in the comments that you want the next part, smash that like and hype button to support the video, and subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss any new updates.